The first thing I remember clearly from the hospital was waking with my fingers wrapped around a woman's hand. I did not know where I was yet, why there was an IV taped to my arm, or why the room smelled like disinfectant and stale air conditioning. I only knew somebody was sitting beside the bed, and when I opened my eyes, a nurse with dark hair pulled back from her face was looking down at our joined hands with an expression somewhere between amusement and concern. I let go so quickly that I almost pulled the IV line with me. "Sorry," I said, my voice rough enough that the word barely sounded like mine. She caught my wrist before I could make things worse and said, "Easy, Gavin. You've already caused enough trouble tonight." My name is Gavin Rhodes. I'm 30, and until that night I had spent most of my adult life treating exhaustion like an inconvenience that could be defeated with coffee. I worked as a commercial electrical technician, and the previous few weeks had been a mess of overtime, emergency calls, and a job running behind schedule, because another crew had made mistakes before we arrived. I had been sleeping 4 or 5 hours when I was lucky, eating whenever I remembered, and telling everybody I was fine because technically I was still standing. Then, sometime shortly after 4 p.m., I stopped standing. One of the guys later told me I had been halfway through explaining a panel problem when I went quiet, leaned against the wall, and folded onto the concrete before anyone could catch me properly. By the time I reached the hospital, I was awake enough to answer questions, but not enough to make any intelligent decisions. I remembered somebody asking about allergies, somebody else telling me I was dehydrated, and me insisting I needed to call work, even though work was the place that had sent me there. What I did not remember was Mara Bennett walking into my room near the beginning of her night shift and recognizing me before she reached the bed. She told me much later that my name on the chart had bothered her because it sounded familiar, but she assumed coincidence until she saw my face. 15 years had changed both of us, but apparently not enough to fool her. At the time, she did not say anything. I was too exhausted to notice recognition on anybody's face, and she had a job to do. My blood pressure had improved, the fluids were helping, and the doctors were not especially interested in my theory that I could go home immediately if somebody removed the IV. Mara checked the line, asked how dizzy I felt, and ignored my claim that I was basically fine. According to her, I fell asleep halfway through trying to explain why I did not need to be there. That sounds exactly like something I would have done. Sometime later, I shifted badly in my sleep and ended up with my arm twisted enough that the IV tubing pulled tight. Mara came back in, lowered the rail, and carefully moved my forearm onto a pillow. I barely woke. When her hand touched mine, my fingers closed around it before she could pull away. She thought I was awake until I said very quietly, "Mom, don't leave me." I have no memory of saying those words. I only know they happened because Mara eventually told me, and even then it took me a while to believe her. My mother had been dead for years by that point. So had my father. There was no dramatic secret in my chart explaining the whole story, only an emergency contact section that listed a coworker because there was nobody else I could reasonably ask to drive across town if something happened. Mara did not wake me and did not ask questions I was in no condition to answer. She stayed beside the bed for a few minutes while she finished documenting something on the computer, letting me hold on until my grip loosened on its own. Then she eased her hand away and continued her rounds. A couple of hours later came the moment I actually remembered. I woke, found her beside me again, and discovered that at some point my hand had drifted back against hers while she was checking the pulse oximeter on my finger. That was when I apologized and nearly attacked my own IV in the process. Mara steadied my wrist, waited until I stopped moving, and asked if I knew where I was. "Hospital," I said. "Very impressive. I have excellent deductive skills." She glanced at the IV. "Apparently not excellent enough to know when you're exhausted." I looked at her properly for the first time. There was something familiar about her face, but it was the kind of familiarity that made the problem worse instead of solving it. She had brown eyes, a calm voice, and the irritating confidence of somebody who knew exactly why I should recognize her. Her badge said Mara Bennett, RN. I read it once, then again. "Have we met?" I asked. Mara stared at me for a second, and I saw the answer register before she spoke. "Seriously?" I searched her face again. Nothing useful arrived. She folded her arms loosely. "You still don't remember me?" There was a smile in her voice, but I could also tell I had managed to disappoint her a little. I asked whether she was sure she had the right Gavin Rhodes. Unless there were 2 Gavin Rhodeses in Mr. Callahan's junior history class who spent most of the semester pretending to take notes. That hit something. Not a full memory, just the name of a teacher, the room with tall windows, and a vague image of desks arranged in rows. I looked back at Mara, trying to fit the woman standing beside my hospital bed into a classroom I had not thought about in more than a decade. "You went to Eastbrook?" I asked. Mara gave me a look that was almost offensive in its patience. There we go, tiny progress. I told her this was unfair because I was dehydrated, medicated, and apparently operating with reduced historical memory. She laughed, and that was the first thing about her that felt oddly familiar, even though I still could not place why. Before leaving the room, she adjusted the blanket I had kicked halfway to the floor and said, "Think windows, 3rd row, 2 seats over." Then she walked out before I could ask for another clue. I lay there staring at the doorway after she left, suddenly more awake than I had been all evening. Somewhere in my past was a girl named Mara Bennett, who remembered me immediately after 15 years, while I could barely reconstruct where she had sat. I did not know yet why that bothered me so much. I only knew I wanted her to come back before her shift ended, because being forgotten by someone is one thing. Discovering that you were apparently memorable to them is something else entirely. Mara came back, a little after 1 a.m., carrying a plastic cup of water, and the expression of someone who already knew. I had spent the last hour trying to solve her like a puzzle. I had remembered the classroom by then, and I remembered Mr. Callahan well enough to know Mara's clue had been accurate, but the girl sitting 2 seats over was still mostly a blur. I told her that before she could ask. Mara handed me the water and said, "Good, at least you're failing honestly now." I told her 15 years was a long time. Interesting defense from a man who apparently remembers exactly where Mr. Callahan kept confiscated phones. That memory arrived instantly. I pointed at her. "Top drawer." Mara sighed. "Fantastic. You remember the drawer." The next morning filled in more pieces. I remembered a quiet girl who sat near the windows, usually with her hair tied back and glasses that were a little too large for her face. Mara confirmed both details, then informed me that describing her teenage appearance like a police sketch did not count as remembering her. She had transferred into Eastbrook halfway through junior year, which explained part of the problem. I had already spent years with most of the people in that class, while she had arrived after everyone else's social groups had hardened into place. "I was spectacularly bad at introducing myself," she said while checking my blood pressure. "You would have needed a search warrant to get a full sentence out of me." I looked at the woman calmly ordering me to stop bending my arm while the cuff inflated and told her adulthood had apparently been aggressive. She laughed, and by then I had started noticing the difference between remembering someone and recognizing who they had become. The Mara in my increasingly unreliable memories was quiet enough that I could barely attach a voice to her. The Mara standing beside my bed had no difficulty telling an irritated surgeon that I was still dizzy when I tried to minimize it, and she was even less impressed when I attempted to negotiate an early discharge. She did not hover. That was probably why I tolerated her better than most people in the hospital. She would tell me what mattered, answer the question if I actually had one, and then leave me alone until there was a reason to come back. That night, the floor settled down around 2:00 a.m., and Mara came in to check my fluids. I asked the question I had been thinking about since she gave me the classroom clue. "Why did you remember me?" She paused with one hand on the IV pump. "That's bothering you." I told her it was a little insulting that she had recognized me in a hospital bed after 15 years while I needed a seating chart. Mara finished checking the line before pulling the chair closer to the bed. "You want the embarrassing answer? For me or you? Mostly you." She told me it had happened in the cafeteria a few weeks after she transferred. Mara had been sitting alone with a tray, pretending to read something because staring at a textbook looked more intentional than having nobody to sit with. My table had been nearby. Apparently I had walked past, noticed the empty chair across from me, pulled it out with one foot, and said, "You can sit here if you want." That was it. No dramatic rescue, no confrontation with bullies, no high school movie moment where the entire cafeteria turned to watch. She moved over, ate lunch with us, and I spent most of the meal arguing with another guy about a basketball game. I waited for the part I was supposed to remember. Mara smiled. "There isn't one." I frowned. "That's why you remembered me." She nodded. She had felt like everybody at Eastbrook could see that she was new, even when nobody was paying attention to her at all. I had treated her sitting with us like it required no explanation. She came back to the same table several times afterward, but eventually schedules changed and the school year moved on. To me, it had apparently been ordinary enough to disappear completely. To her, that had been the point. I lay there for a moment, trying to reconstruct the cafeteria and coming up with almost nothing. That's a lot of pressure for one chair. Mara smiled. Don't worry, you've had 15 years to ruin the impression. I told her that was reassuring. She said she had been disappointed for approximately 5 seconds when I did not recognize her, then admitted it was probably unreasonable considering how different she looked now. Also, she added, you were unconscious when I first saw you, so I had an unfair advantage. I asked whether unconscious me had made a particularly strong impression. Mara's expression shifted just enough that I noticed, but she only said, you were very committed to sleeping. After that, the shared history stopped feeling like a mystery we had to solve, and started giving us somewhere to begin. I learned Mara had gone to nursing school in Cincinnati, before eventually returning to Columbus. She learned I had gone straight into an electrical apprenticeship after graduation instead of college. I told her I liked work where either something functioned or it did not, because wires were usually less complicated than people. Mara said that explained several things about me already. I asked how she had become a nurse when teenage Mara apparently hated speaking to strangers. Repetition, she said. And eventually I realized most people are too worried about themselves to spend much time judging you. It was a simple answer, but it told me more about her than the old classroom memories did. At some point she asked who had been notified when I came in. I told her one of the guys from work was listed as my emergency contact, because there was not really anybody else nearby. Mara did not immediately ask why, which made answering easier. I told her my father had died when I was 20, and my mother a few years later. There were relatives in other states, but nobody who belonged on a form saying, call this person at midnight. Mara only said she was sorry and asked whether my coworker could pick me up when I was discharged. I told her probably, then made a joke about charging him mileage. She let me change the subject without trying to drag me back. What I did not know was that she was now carrying the context for something I had said while half asleep. Mara kept it to herself. At the time, all I noticed was that her expression softened for a second before she stood to leave. I found myself asking when her shift ended. She told me 7 a.m. Why? I said I was only calculating how long I had left to recover my dignity before another nurse took over. Mara looked toward the door. You're assuming I've seen your worst. I told her that sounded threatening. Get some sleep, Gavin. By the following afternoon, the doctor told me I would probably go home the next day if my numbers stayed where they were. That should have been the best news I had heard since arriving. Instead, my first thought was that Mara was working another night shift, and then I would leave. The hospital had been the last place I wanted to be 24 hours earlier. Somehow, getting out of it now came with one complication I had not expected. Once I was discharged, Mara Bennett would stop having any reason at all to walk back through my door. Discharge morning felt strangely ordinary considering how much I had wanted it 24 hours earlier. A different nurse brought the paperwork. The doctor repeated the same warnings about sleep, hydration, and not pretending dizziness was a personality trait, and one of the guys from work texted that he could pick me up at 10:30 a.m. Mara came in near the end of her shift to check one last set of vitals. I told her I hoped I never saw her at work again. She looked up from the monitor and said, "That's actually one of the nicer things a patient can tell me." I almost asked for her number right there, but she was still wearing scrubs, still carrying my chart, and technically still responsible for me. The question stalled somewhere between my brain and my mouth. Mara noticed. I could tell because she waited half a second longer than necessary before saying, "Take care of yourself, Gavin." Then she walked out without rescuing me from my own hesitation. 4 days later, I was back at the hospital for a follow-up appointment in another department. I was sleeping more, eating actual meals, and feeling enough like myself that I had already started getting irritated by everyone asking whether I was taking it easy. The appointment ended around 7:20 a.m., which meant I was walking past the hospital cafe just as the night shift was getting out. I saw Mara before she saw me. Without the navy scrubs, badge, and pulled-back hair, she looked less like someone from the room where I had spent 2 days and more like a woman I might have noticed anywhere. She was wearing jeans, a gray sweater, and her hair loose around her shoulders. Staring at a cup of coffee like it had personally disappointed her, I almost kept walking. Not because I did not want to see her, but because the hospital had given us an easy structure. She came into my room because it was her job. I talked to her because I was stuck there. Approaching her now meant admitting I wanted something that no chart or shift schedule required. Mara looked up before I could overthink it and smiled. "You're walking upright. Huge improvement." I stopped at her table and told her I had been practicing. She asked how the follow-up went, and after I answered, I looked at the empty chair across from her. "Can I sit?" Mara glanced at it and said, "You can sit here if you want." I laughed because I knew exactly what she had done. For a few minutes we talked the way we had in my hospital room, except the difference in setting changed everything. Mara was off the clock. She did not need to check my blood pressure, ask about pain, or make sure I was drinking enough water. When she told me I looked less terrible, I could tell her that was an unnecessarily low standard, without worrying that she would put it in my chart. Eventually, I stopped trying to find a clever way around the question. "Would you have coffee with me sometime when neither of us is working and neither of us is in a hospital?" Mara studied me for a moment, and I realized I was more nervous than I had been doing live electrical work on systems that could actually kill me. "That's a very specific invitation," she said. I told her I had spent 4 days refining it. Mara smiled, unlocked her phone, and slid it across the table. "Put your number in." I did, then handed it back. She sent me a message immediately so I would have hers. The text said, "Try not to collapse before Saturday." I looked at her. Very compassionate. I'm off duty. That was the moment I understood the attraction had survived the hospital. If anything, I liked her more when she was not responsible for being patient with me. We stayed another 20 minutes, and somewhere in the conversation I asked what I had been like the first night. Most of it was missing from my memory, and Mara had made enough vague comments that I knew there was something she had not told me. She looked into her coffee before answering. "You want the honest version?" I said yes. Mara told me about adjusting my arm, me grabbing her hand, and the words I had said without opening my eyes. She did not dramatize it. She simply repeated them. "Mom, don't leave me." I felt the embarrassment before I could stop it. My first instinct was to make the moment smaller. "Well, that's horrifying." Mara shook her head. "It wasn't." I asked if I had been crying or doing anything else that would permanently ruin my reputation. "No, you were exhausted." I tried another joke about charging the hospital for emotional damages, but even I could hear how forced it sounded. Mara did not push me to explain my parents or tell me what the moment supposedly meant. She only said, "You were half asleep. You thought I was someone else." I looked at her for a second, then asked the question I probably should not have. "So why were you still there when I woke up holding your hand?" Mara's expression softened. "Because you didn't let go for a while." I stared at the table. She could have stopped there, but after a moment she added, "I stayed until you did." That landed harder than anything sympathetic would have. There was no speech about grief, strength, or learning to need people. She had simply stayed beside a half-conscious man she remembered from high school because he had asked someone not to leave, even though he did not know who she was. I told her I was sorry she had been put in that position. Mara immediately dismissed that part. "You didn't do anything wrong." Then she pointed at me with her coffee cup. "But if you call me Mom on Saturday, the date is over." I laughed, grateful she had given me a way back into the conversation, without erasing what had happened. "So Saturday is officially a date?" Mara leaned back in her chair. "You asked me for coffee outside the hospital. I'm choosing to interpret that generously." I told her dinner would be less ambiguous. 7? She smiled. 7. When we finally stood, Mara headed toward the staff exit and I toward the parking garage. There was no medical reason for us to see each other again. No forgotten memory left to solve, and no professional obligation keeping her near me. I had her number because I had asked to see her, and Saturday existed because she had said yes. For the first time since waking up with her hand in mine, I knew exactly who I was reaching for. Saturday went well enough that I almost convinced myself the difficult part was over. Mara and I had dinner at a small Italian place near German Village, walked for almost an hour afterward, and discovered that outside the hospital we were just as good at making each other laugh without a monitor beeping nearby. She told me about a patient who had once tried to hide a cheeseburger under a blanket 5 hours after surgery because he was supposed to be fasting. I told her about an apprentice who had spent 20 minutes troubleshooting a dead circuit before realizing he had never turned the breaker back on. By the time I dropped Mara off, I already knew I wanted to see her again, and when I kissed her outside her building, she kissed me back without hesitation. It should have been simple from there. The problem was that wanting someone in your life and actually making room for them turned out to be two different skills. For the next couple of weeks, we worked around each other's schedules. Sometimes I met Mara for breakfast when she finished a night shift, and I was starting later than usual. Sometimes she came over for dinner before heading to the hospital, and once we spent most of a Sunday walking through an outdoor market because neither of us had anywhere else we needed to be. Mara never acted as if my work was a flaw she needed to fix. She liked hearing about difficult jobs, understood why I was proud of being the person people trusted when something went wrong, and never once told me I should find an easier career. That actually made what happened next harder to defend. I had promised her Saturday evening. Nothing complicated, just dinner and a movie at my place, because Mara had worked 3 nights in a row and wanted something quiet. Around noon, one of the technicians called and asked if I could cover the rest of his shift. His kid was sick and the site was behind. I said yes before I really thought about it. That was the habit. Somebody needed help. I had the ability to provide it, so I provided it. I texted Mara at 2:14 p.m. and told her I would probably be working until 7, but could move everything back a couple of hours. Her response came a few minutes later. "Don't worry about tonight. Get your work done. We'll figure out another day." I read the message and felt relieved for about 30 seconds. Mara was being reasonable. She understood. Nobody was angry. Then I realized she had not said she would wait until 9. She had simply canceled the evening. I called her after work, expecting that, once I explained the situation, we could rearrange things. Mara answered while she was making dinner for herself. She was not cold, but she also did not rush to make me feel better about it. I told her the guy who called had a sick kid and the job needed coverage. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm not mad." I asked if she wanted me to come over anyway. Mara paused before answering. "Not tonight." That got my attention more effectively than an argument would have. I asked whether I had done something wrong. Mara let out a tired laugh and said, "Gavin, I rearranged my weekend because we had plans. You rearranged ours because someone asked you to work." I started explaining that the shift had needed somebody, but she stopped me before I could build a courtroom defense. "I'm not asking you to stop helping people. I'm not asking you to care less about your job." She went quiet for a second, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. "I like you. I just don't want to only get whatever part of you work didn't use." There were about 5 different answers I could have given, and most of them involved pointing out that this had only happened once. The problem was that even as I thought it, I knew she was not really talking about one Saturday. I had spent years being the person who always said yes. Extra call? Yes. Someone needed coverage? Yes. Weekend job running behind? Sure. I treated my own time like it was the least important thing on the schedule, because there had never been anyone else whose plans were attached to it. Mara had not asked to become more important than my work. She was asking whether a commitment to her counted as a commitment at all. I told her I was sorry. Mara accepted it without turning the conversation into a relationship summit. She did not demand a promise, did not remind me that overwork had already put me in the hospital, and did not use the fact that she was a nurse to make the point stronger. "I don't need you to prove anything tonight," she said. "Just don't ask me to keep rearranging my life around a schedule you won't protect." Then she wished me good night. The call ended without a breakup, a dramatic silence, or anything I could blame on misunderstanding. That was almost worse. Mara had been perfectly clear. I sat at my kitchen table afterward and opened the calendar on my phone. The next 3 weeks were packed with things I had agreed to automatically. 2 overtime Saturdays, an early Sunday inspection that another technician could easily handle, a weekday job I had volunteered to stay late for before anyone even asked. None of those choices made me a victim of my job. They were choices I had made because being available had become part of how I understood myself. I liked being dependable, I still did, but somewhere along the way, dependable had started meaning everybody else could claim my time before I decided what I wanted to do with it. I did not call Mara again that night with a better apology. I knew words would be easy, and easy was exactly the problem. Instead, I went through the schedule and separated the things that actually required me from the things I had simply volunteered to absorb. I kept the jobs that were genuinely mine. I gave 2 others back to the rotation. It felt strangely uncomfortable, which probably told me more than I wanted to know. The following Wednesday, Mara and I had dinner after her shift. She did not ask whether I had changed my schedule, and I did not announce it like I deserved a medal. We talked, laughed, and kissed goodbye the same way we had before, but something between us had become more precise. The next Saturday was already ours. Then Friday afternoon, my supervisor stopped beside my workbench and told me one of the guys had called out. He asked if I could cover Saturday. For years, I had answered that question before anybody finished asking it. This time, Mara was already on my calendar. My supervisor barely finished asking before the old answer rose automatically in my throat. Saturday overtime meant good money. The job was already behind, and I knew the system well enough that putting me on it would make everybody's day easier. 6 weeks earlier, I would have said yes and sent Mara another message explaining why our plans needed to move. Instead, I looked at the schedule clipped beside my bench and said, "I can't Saturday." My supervisor nodded, asked the next technician and walked away. That was it. Nobody accused me of abandoning the company. The building did not lose power. The strange part was how much weight I had given a decision that everyone else accepted in 5 seconds. I did not immediately text Mara to announce what I had done. Declining one extra shift was not a romantic achievement, and I did not want praise for honoring a plan I had already made. Saturday morning, I slept until almost 8 a.m., made breakfast instead of drinking coffee over the sink, and spent an hour doing absolutely nothing productive. By early afternoon, I felt restless enough that I finally understood why slowing down had always been difficult for me. Work gave every hour a purpose. Free time required me to decide what I actually wanted. That evening, what I wanted was simple. I showered, changed, and drove to Mara's apartment 10 minutes earlier than I needed to. She opened the door wearing jeans and a green sweater, looked past me toward the hallway and said, "No emergency electrician behind you." I told her I had checked. "No collapsing coworkers?" Also checked. Mara grabbed her coat. "You seem dangerously available." I smiled and told her not to get used to it. The joke worked because neither of us needed to pretend the previous Saturday had not happened. We went to a small restaurant she had mentioned near the river, and for the first hour we talked about almost everything except schedules. She told me about a new nurse on her floor, who was still learning which doctors could handle being interrupted, and which ones needed 10 seconds to believe interruption had been their own idea. I told her about an apprentice who had finally completed a difficult installation without calling me every 15 minutes. It felt good to be there without checking my phone beneath the table. Eventually, Mara asked how work had been. I told her someone had asked me to cover that day. She looked at me for a second. "And?" I said I had already had plans. Mara's expression softened, but she did not turn it into a celebration. "Was the job okay without you?" "Apparently the electrical industry survived." She smiled. I told her I was not planning to become the guy who refused overtime forever or suddenly stopped caring about being dependable. That was part of me, and I actually liked that part. I just realized if I want another person in my life, I can't keep offering them whatever time nobody else claimed first. Mara rested her hand beside her glass. That's all I was asking. I told her I knew that now. She did not tell me she was proud of me or explain what healthy balance looked like. Instead, she changed the subject and asked whether I had remembered anything else about high school. I had, actually. Not enough to rescue my reputation completely, but enough to remember Mara sitting at our lunch table more than once after the day with the empty chair. I remembered her laughing quietly when one of my friends dropped an entire carton of chocolate milk into his backpack. I remembered lending her a pencil in history and never getting it back. Mara immediately denied that accusation. I told her memory was apparently my weakness, so she had an unfair advantage. After dinner, we walked along the river until the temperature dropped enough that Mara shoved both hands into her coat pockets. I admitted something that had been bothering me since she told me why she remembered me. What she had carried for 15 years as an important moment had been so ordinary to me that I had forgotten it. Mara looked out toward the water and said, "That's why I remembered it." I asked what she meant. "You weren't trying to impress me. You weren't trying to rescue the new girl. You just saw an empty chair and made room." She shrugged. Sometimes the things people remember about us aren't the things we thought were important. We stopped beside my truck when I drove her home, and for a moment neither of us reached for the door. Mara looked at me and smiled. "You know, this is considerably less better than the last time I sat beside you while you were half conscious." I groaned. "Are we ever retiring that story?" "Absolutely not." I reached across the console and took her hand. The movement made both of us quiet because we understood the callback at the same time. The first time I had held Mara's hand, I had not known where I was, who she was, or even what I was asking her for. This time I knew all three. I rubbed my thumb lightly across her fingers and said, "Stay a little longer." Mara's smile changed. You know who you're asking this time? I looked directly at her. Yeah, I do. She stayed, and nothing more complicated was required. I did not need Mara because she was a nurse, because she remembered a lonely version of me from high school, or because she happened to be there when I finally ran myself into the ground. I wanted the woman sitting beside me now, and for once I had made room before life forced me to. Meeting Mara again did not teach me that work was bad, or that being independent was some kind of flaw. It just made me notice how too easily independence could become a life arranged for only one person. I had spent years being available whenever everybody else needed me. Choosing Mara started when I finally became just as deliberate about being available for someone I wanted.
The hospital was only the place where Gavin and Mara met again. The real beginning had happened 15 years earlier, when a quiet new student sat alone in a cafeteria and Gavin casually pulled out a chair for her. He forgot the moment because to him it had been nothing special. Mara remembered it precisely because he had made belonging feel ordinary instead of turning her loneliness into a spectacle. Years later, she recognized him on sight while he needed half a night and a classroom clue to place her. Their reunion also caught Gavin at the worst possible point in the life he had built. He had worked himself into dehydration and exhaustion, had no family nearby to put on an emergency form, and was so depleted that he grabbed Mara's hand in his sleep and asked his mother not to leave. Mara did not use that vulnerable moment to force intimacy. She stayed until he released her hand, kept the story private until he later asked, and treated him like an adult even when he was terrible at treating himself like one. That restraint mattered because Gavin was already uncomfortable with needing anyone at all. Once Gavin left the hospital, the question became whether their connection belonged only to that room. He answered it by approaching Mara when she was off duty, and asking her out with no medical excuse between them. Their dates made it clear the attraction was real, but the harder test came after the romance started. Gavin was used to making himself available to work before he considered what he wanted, and when he canceled plans with Mara to cover another shift, she pointed out the cost without asking him to become a different person. That conversation changed the direction of the relationship more than any romantic gesture did. Mara did not demand that Gavin stop caring about his job. She asked him to treat time promised to her as something worth protecting. Gavin eventually understood that being dependable did not require volunteering every unclaimed hour of his life, so when overtime threatened their next Saturday, he finally said no without turning the choice into a performance for her. The world at work carried on without him, which exposed how much pressure he had been putting on himself. By the end, the hand-holding that began when Gavin was barely conscious had become something completely different. In his truck, he took Amara's hand while fully awake and asked her to stay a little longer. This time he knew exactly who she was, exactly what he wanted, and more importantly, he had finally started making room for it. There are two kinds of care running through this story, and neither one is especially dramatic. The first is the kindness Gavin once offered Mara without realizing it mattered. Pulling out a cafeteria chair was forgettable to him because he expected nothing in return. For Mara, that was exactly why it stayed with her. The story quietly makes the point that people can carry our smallest acts for years while we remember only the moments we thought were important. The second kind of care is harder for Gavin because it requires boundaries rather than generosity. He already knows how to show up when somebody needs help. What he does not know is how to protect time for a relationship when no emergency is forcing him to. That is why Mara's response to the canceled Saturday works so well. She never competes with his career or uses his hospitalization as leverage. She simply refuses to become the person who receives whatever is left after everyone else has claimed him. Gavin's growth is not learning to work less for the sake of romance. It is learning that a life shared with someone cannot be built entirely from leftover time. That makes his final request for Mara to stay feel earned instead of sentimental. One forgotten chair in a cafeteria, one hand held in a hospital room, and one Saturday Gavin finally protected from work all changed this relationship in different ways. Tell me which of those moments carried the most weight for you, and why. Add your take in the comments. If you enjoy romances where the emotional shift comes through small choices instead of huge drama, leave a like and subscribe for the next story.